Hello everyone, my name is Kelvin Gerardo from the AusIMM, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Future of the Mining Industry and ESG, presented by Kevin Brady, Alexandra Almanada and Ron Douglas. I would like to thank you for attending the live webinar today, and those of you who are viewing a recorded version. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Everyone is on mute today to avoid presenter distraction and noise feedback. Should you want to ask any questions, you can type them into the question box available to you on your side panel. A copy of the webinar will be sent via email to everyone who is registered in the next few weeks. We also have a quick exit survey when you leave the webinar. So on that note, I would now like to hand over to Kevin Brady. Thank you.
Thanks, Calvin. Welcome everybody to this third in a series of webinars on ESG and mining, sponsored by Ausenco and AusIMM. I'm the Director of Sustainability Services, and I'm going to kick this off. We go to the next slide, Alexandra. Just as a reminder, we had the two other webinars were focused on different aspects of ESG and mining. The first was on embedding ESG in mining projects from concept to operation. And the second one was looking at cutting edge technologies that mining companies are using to reduce their environmental social footprint. Both of those webinars, plus the one we're doing today, will be available from the AusIMM website next week. And if we go to the next slide. So you've seen the presenters. I'm going to be talking about ESG and as a sort of a design field for the future. Alexandra is then going to talk about ESG and mining in the Latin American context. And then Ron Douglas, our Executive Vice President, will be talking about mining and the energy transition. I should mention that Alexandra is Vice President of Environment and Sustainability for our South American operations. Next slide, please. So actually, you can go to the next one, Alexandra. I mean, why did we want to talk about mining in the future? You know, we've done a lot of corporate strategy work over the years. There's always an exercise that you want to do in strategic planning where you bring in as much information to the discussion as possible in order to set the appropriate, proper strategic direction and priorities for your organization. And what's different today, maybe more broadly than say 10, 15 years ago, is that we're increasingly bringing in social and environmental information, non-financial information into that discussion. And we're trying to cast out into the future to see what can we expect, right? What are the expectations of society on organizations around these issues? What are the regulatory trends going to look like? What are the technology trends going to look like? How is that going to affect how we do business? And we bring that back to our baseline situation today, and we use that information to decide on priorities, identify creative solutions. And you know, we do that more effectively if we have a real broad lens of what the future might look like. And you know, fortunately, there's a lot of people that are thinking about these things in areas like climate change, in areas like social inequality, in technology, AI, and these sorts of things. So you know, we want to talk about the future because it's really important for putting forward the proper strategy for companies in this industry to move forward effectively and in line with the expectations of society. And next slide, Alexandra, please. So just to illustrate this, I did an exercise with Alcoa. This was back in 2005, working with senior executives from across their global operations, looking at what the future would look like. We asked them to sit back, take a bit of time, think about what the world's going to be looking like in 2030. So that was a 25-year ahead perspective. And what did they come up with? They came up with markets for carbon and pricing of carbon. They talked about security issues around mining operations. They talked about population growth and the rise of China and India as driving consumption of materials and metals. They talked about trade liberalization as something that they thought was going to expand. Chain of custody requirements for materials. People wanting to know more where the material comes from. So where was it mined? Who touched it along the way until it got into my consumer product that I'm either designing or buying. They talked about production processes pressure, so cleaner production, less pollution, less environmental impacts around production. We called it cleaner production back then. They talked about energy supply challenges. This was the time of peak oil, and so there was a lot of concerns about that, and there was also a rising understanding that we need to move to less carbon-intensive energy carriers. We talked about competition for labor increasing in the future, market expectations for sustainability increasing, AI and IT advancements improving efficiency and that sort of thing. So, what we asked them to do there is look into the future and then say, well, what does it mean for mining? What does it mean for our operations? And I just, out of curiosity, it's been a long time since I worked for Alcoa. I went back and I looked at their 2020 sustainability report, and 78% of their energy is from renewable sources now. I can't make a causal link to this conversation that we had, but it's interesting to see the direction they took. And they use this future planning exercise to help guide that direction. I think if you go to the next slide, if we had this conversation today, I think we'd add some other things into the mix. They were pretty prescient. They really saw pretty clearly, I think, where things are going. But if you can get the next slide. I mean, today we might be talking about, the expansion of the circular economy. So moving from a, take, make, waste linear system to a circular system where minerals and metals are brought back into productive use in the economy and optimized. We'd probably be thinking about investor activity around ESG performance and the pressure on the sector, and how far is that going to go? We're seeing so much money pouring into green and ESG investment funds, and what's that mean for the future? We might be talking about equitable wealth distribution and how if that problem isn't solved globally, it might cause problems in jurisdictions where we're operating mines and community issues and regulatory governmental issues as well. We might be talking about restorative actions. So, how do we ensure that as a whole, the industry does its part to do rehabilitation and reclamation of mining sites. Of course, electrification of everything, it seems these days, would be something to think about. Adapting to climate impacts and building more resilient projects that could withstand more extreme weather events and heat regimes. We're probably thinking about, how far our company is going to go to fully integrate environmental, social issues, governance practices to drive that forward into their strategies and business processes. And, we're talking about this last one today, multi-stakeholder design-driven performance standards, chain of custody certification systems. Those things are with us today, but they're going to proliferate. We have things like models now, like the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, which has brought together the mining producers, the converters of those materials, some of the product manufacturers that use aluminum or aluminum, and what part of the world you're in, and the car companies and the recycling industry, and they work together to set performance standards and chain of custody procedures, and even online auditing systems to make it easier to verify performance or adherence to the standards, and clear lines of sight in terms of chain of custody. So I think there's more of that coming. We go to the next slide. little bit of a lag, but we're all right. And just to illustrate more of that coming, now here are some of the standards that are out there right now that are driving change in the industry. We have a number of mining-specific standards, we have the commodity-specific standards, and we have broadly applicable standards that people are asking various companies to adhere to. So what's the future of that look like? You know, there's challenges here, like companies are getting overwhelmed with questions about their adherence to some of these standards. Some of them are very important because they're tied to money. So IFC standards, for example, if you're getting money through the Principles of Responsible Investing member, they're asking for adherence to IFC standards. If you're looking at markets, you know, the Responsible Minerals Initiative, which is an initiative that's brought all the car companies together, not all, but many of the biggest car companies in the world, many of the biggest electronics companies in the world, like Apple and Samsung, and industries from 8 other sectors, which have all got together and said, okay, we want to ensure that our minerals and metal supply chain is responsible and is governed properly, and they've set an ESG standard. So, you know, and a number of standards are related to membership. So if you're a member of ICMM, you need to follow their principles, and you know, there's other ones that are out there that are tied to commodity associations, for example. So where's that all going to go? How is it going to get harmonized? How are we going to find out what are the most important things to measure and commonly measure? That's up in the air right now, and it's a bit challenging to understand where it's going to head. Next slide, please. Another way to look at the future was developed by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So back in 2010, they brought together 39 companies and about 200 experts and a whole bunch of stakeholder engagement meetings to try to define what a sustainable world looks like. And they looked at, you know, major categories, sectors, as well as social categories like values and human development. They looked at the economy, they looked at agriculture, forestry, energy, buildings, mobility, materials, and they tried to cast out what does a sustainable world look like. And when they looked at things like our materials in the mining industry, they talked about zero waste, you know, which is a very aspirational type of goal, but the idea here is to have these aspirational goals that will open up the innovation space and drive people's thinking away from incremental change into really innovative change. And they talked about, you know, closing the loop in terms of materials, which is now morphed into the circular economy conversation. They talked about improving efficiency by a factor of 4 or 10, and they did that across these different sectors and issue areas. So on human development, you know, the goal is basically human needs being met across the globe. So, you know, an interesting take on how to look at the future. And the next slide is a governmental take. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So this is a governmental initiative, UN and national government initiative, to really kind of define what the future should be. What are the goals that we need to strive for to have a sustainable society? You know, a number of these goals are very relevant for the minerals and mining industry. So affordable clean energy is about the application of materials, and Ron's going to talk a bit more about that later. You know, responsible consumption and production processes. And they talk about issues, so you know, water, climate, land use, these sorts of things are all part and parcel of our business, and we need to be thinking about it. So, you know, we can look to these goals as another sort of thing to strive for in the future, and many companies are utilizing these goals to try to direct their sustainability ESG activities, including our own. In our last ESG report in 2020, our first one actually, we used these goals to kind of guide some of the information that we were providing to our stakeholders. Next slide. Gives us a little mental break to think about, though, the information. Another way to look at this is what the World Economic Forum does. Every year they put out a global risk report. They characterize those risks as economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and technological risks. They've characterized them in this year's report as clear and present dangers, knock-on effects, and existential threats, which basically goes from 0 to 10 years in time frame. And if we look at these risks that they're identifying, both the short-term and the long-term risks, they're very relevant for the minerals and metals industry, of course. So, exposure to extreme weather effects, we're all facing that. Social cohesion erosion is something that I'd never think about happening in leading democracies, but it is. Going out into the future, biodiversity loss, natural resource crisis, these sorts of risks are all relevant to our industry. And when we're looking into the future, we need to take that information into account in order to develop appropriate structured strategies to meet this future world, right? And to do our part to collaborate to mitigate these risks. And I think I got one more slide, Alexander. Two, actually. So, what do we need to be looking at? What do we need to be focusing on as we think about the future of mining? So all of those standards that I showed you have performance expectations in them related to environmental and social performance and how we govern that. And there's a kind of a structure in those standards where what they're looking for is, acknowledge the issue, have a policy in place to address it, have a management system structure to move on the policy objectives that you put in place, have programs to drive performance forward, and have data and reporting mechanisms to share information, whether it be with investors or communities or other stakeholders. You can see just on the environment front here, there's policies, management systems, and they're looking at programs on climate, on water, on emissions. If it's the mining sector, it's tailings management as well, and supply chain and these sorts of things. On the governance front, they're looking for commitment, they're looking for ethical business practices, they're looking for governance and accountability mechanisms, stakeholder engagement, risk management procedures that take into account these environmental and social issues and ensure that they're being governed appropriately and moving the yardsticks in the right direction. Next slide, please. So I'm going to close on this. Technology is an important solution for avoiding some of the problems that we're facing. Lots of work being done on green energy technologies, low carbon energy technologies. Lots of thought being put into how we use all this data and information that we're gathering around the world to monitor performance and improve performance and direct mining operations in many cases in the right way. We've got blockchain as a platform for credible, verifiable information, and that's being applied in the sector. So on a more of an upbeat note, I think these technological risks and opportunities are key things that we need to be monitoring and grabbing and integrating into our projects as we go forward. So that's just a quick overview of the sort of future discussion and what's in store and what we need to be looking at and managing from an ESG perspective. And now I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra to talk about ESG activity in Latin America and what she's seen on the ground there. And Alexandra's based in Peru.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for the opportunity of joining this webinar. As you have heard in the introduction, my experience is based in Latin America, and therefore my intention for today is to share with you some reflections on the future of ESG from a Latin American perspective. You may ask, why is it relevant to discuss Latin American in an Australian-based webinar? And I'll start by explaining. We have heard from Kevin that one of the most relevant topics for ESG is climate change and transition to a net zero green economy. We have also heard that this transition requires of the mining industry to generate the metals required for this transition. And Latin America happens to be one of the most relevant mining regions. In addition, Australian mining and metals companies have significant assets displayed in this region, making it necessary to understand the local situation in Latin America. To give you some examples of the relevance of mining in Latin America, and these are facts that you may already know. For example, Chile, Peru, and Mexico alone produce 50% of total world copper production. Chile, Argentina, and Brazil produce about 30% of total world lithium production. However, and adding Bolivia to this mix, the countries hold 65% of the total world reserves of lithium, I'm sorry. And going all these relevant metals for the energy transition, and therefore to achieve ESG objectives for the future. And understanding that Latin America is needed for this energy transition, our task is to support that mining in the future is developed in Latin America in the most sustainable way. However, this is not without challenges, and I'll go to speak of some of these challenges that the region is currently facing and that are directly related to the need of also pushing companies to incorporate ESG best practices. Our major challenge, and of course not unique to Latin America, is social inequality. Social inequality is increasing political instability in the region, and mining activities are a good, if not the main target, because of the negative perceptions against the industry. As I include in my comment in this slide, communities in most countries in the region have the perception that mining is conducted by foreign companies that take away non-renewable resources that are owned by communities, and that they are not receiving any benefits from the use of their lands. It is relevant to mention that mining in Latin America happens in most cases in isolated areas with the highest levels of poverty. Of course, communities don't understand the investment required for a mining project to come to place, or the taxation scheme. And to add to this problem, local governments have generally poor capacity to execute infrastructure projects, and in the end, locals do not receive effective benefits. This is, of course, a huge task for mining, to learn how to coexist with rural communities and address their needs without replacing the roles and responsibility of the government. The result of all these perceptions is that mining is probably the most conflicted industry in the region, with 284 social conflicts related to mining registered a few months ago by the Observatory of Mining Conflicts in Latin America. On the images to the right, a picture from a protest in an anti-mining province in Argentina. This is Catamarca, which happens to be a region that has several important lithium and copper reserves. Below, an image from the Apumayu mining camp. This is in the Ayacucho region in Peru that was invaded by locals and set on fire 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately, and not with the aim of entering into any political conversation, extreme left-wing governments are gaining a space in countries in most of Latin America, with messages including speeches of nationalization, promotion of state-owned companies, and or increasing taxes to mining companies. And this is creating more rejection and promoting strikes and complaints from locals. I could continue to speak about this a lot, but I will end this slide by saying that there are many positive ESG approaches that mining companies are currently taking to alleviate and improve these community relations. But overall, it is a growing pain that goes beyond what private companies can do. Going to the next slide, and as a second issue, I'll speak on permitting. And it is relevant to mention that during the 90s, most Latin American countries modernized their legal frameworks, making them attractive for foreign investors. Environment and social conflicts, of course, have fostered stricter regulations around mining worldwide, which is, of course, very positive and aligned with our objectives in ESG. But the region is experiencing significant delays in approvals of permits for exploration, for construction, for operation, and in some cases, which unfortunately are becoming more popular nowadays, rejecting mining licenses in the name of environmental issues. However, it is important to take note that these growing social conflicts, as explained before, are placing additional pressure in government and also or especially in environmental authorities to award licenses and permits. An example, as presented in the image to the right, is the recent non-acceptance and filing of the Quebradona Environmental Impact Assessment Permit from Anglo Gold Ashanti in Colombia. And also to the right, another image of protests in Chile as a result of questioning the licenses that were awarded to start rare earth projects. As mentioned before, we have a huge number of greenfield projects that can happen in Latin America in the next decade. And of course, all these projects will require an energy supply. And at the same time, these projects have the capacity of providing development opportunities for rural communities, which at the same time will increase their energy demands. This represents a unique opportunity for Latin America to design a decarbonized energy grid. And once again, this isn't without challenges. For example, there is a significant number of renewable projects in construction or under a plan in the region, but owners are facing issues connecting to the national grid system, as there are delays in government completing transmission lines and infrastructure to support this energy transmission. In addition, high inflation in some of the countries or most of the countries in the region and tax barrier and at the same time, poor dialogue that is not happening between government and investors are additional reasons that weaken the capacity of renewable projects. And once again, the requirement of consultation and approval from local communities is delaying investments, same as for mining. In the picture to the right, this is the estimated mix of electricity generation in the region. There is still a high component of oil, gas, and coal dependence in Latin America. Nonetheless, most countries have committed to net zero targets by 2050, as was mentioned by Kevin. However, the region's ability to meet these targets will depend on how fast the energy policies are set to phase out fossil fuels, and also very dependent on a stable political environment to assure this investment. To give you one example, and this is very close to my heart from Peru, and that links all the different factors that I have spoken about. A mining client recently approached us to evaluate renewable sources of energy for their mining project. But afterwards, identified that changing the energy source would delay the construction of the project. And this was not because of cost, not because of additional infrastructure that was required, but because of additional permitting requirements. Unfortunately, because this would have been a very good opportunity for reducing carbon emissions and, of course, to have better ESG ratings in the future. To conclude, my message is by no means not to invest in Latin America. In fact, we need the global expertise, the lessons learned, and the innovation in mining that countries like Australia have produced to materialize mining in Latin America. And a mining that at the same time has an ESG approach to face the challenges that I have presented before. Finding these innovative ways of conducting business that considers strengthening, for example, local procurement chains, training local communities for them to perceive direct benefits are important to assure that projects will get the social licenses to operate and also the government approvals. I leave you with 3 positive news that have been announced in the last weeks. The first one related to the future investment of 8.4 billion in green hydrogen in Argentina from Fortescue Metals Australia. The next on the lithium triangle boom of Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina that are expected to provide 60 to 70% of the globe lithium by 2025. And the last one on a similar note on the copper potential for Peru and Chile in the following decade. As mentioned, the future of ESG is interlinked on energy transition, which is in turn dependent on mining, and it is on us to make sure that mining in LATAM is sustainable. Thank you, and with that, I turn to Ron.
Good. Thank you, Alexandra and Kevin, for that context setting. I'm going to talk about the energy transition. So jump to the next slide, thanks, Alexandra. When we talk about ESG, we actually, I find most of the conversations talk about a big E, a smaller S, and a very small G. And essentially the E is about the decarbonisation focus on fossil fuels. And we see that daily in the press. So there's a real focus around fossil fuels and then the new metals that need to replace those. And just for context, I've put on here the fossil fuel reserves for both coal, gas, and oil. And then plotted on the right, you can see how the IPCC has indicated the use of those reserves to maintain 1.5 degrees and 1.75 degrees. And the impact of that is that a significant amount of fossil fuel needs to be left in the ground if we're going to be successful in this journey. And it goes a bit to chemistry in that as we look at steel and how to come up with green steel as they're using it, it's essentially heat and then some carbon to try and pull pull the impurities out of the steel. So it is solvable issues that require technology to do it. Move to the next slide. And so we are transitioning, and you read it in the press daily. It is a constant reminder of the large companies, the big public companies with the shareholder base, requiring that they move out of the carbon-based energies, and essentially there is shareholder action and action against banks if anyone supports the carbon world. Interestingly, and I guess you need to look at how transition occurs. In a COP26, we just saw India declare that it is going to head for zero by 2070. So gave themselves more time. And the reason for that actually goes to one of the points that Kevin brought up, and that is about human needs. And India has 300 people in poverty, and poverty is described as being earning less than $2 a day. And if you actually look at below the middle class, they've got 700 or 800 people that really need, struggle for power, struggle to go to school, struggle for all the natural things that we in the Western world take for granted. And if you look at that on a worldwide scale, essentially there's 2 billion people that live at below what we'd call acceptable level in an Australian environment. And in fact, 800 of those are declared as in poverty. And so that's one of the goals that are also in the UN Charter as well. So it's these conflicting elements that we need to deal with in the real world. So we go to the next slide, thanks. And I've put this on, I've got a couple of provocative slides here, and I do this because this causes aberrations basically. And here's an article from the Fin from the 1st of November, and the largest oil company in the world has just declared record profits and record outputs. And you also see the same in both the thermal and the coking coal prices. And so as there's this rush away from fossil fuels, the point of is that they're still so bound up into our society and the needs for humans that it actually is the lever that will drive mining through the approach with ESG type metals as I describe them. So we go to the next slide, please. And this is one of the, I put this up as well because Kevin talked about a key part of the mining industry is not just the extraction and the use of metals, but it is how you recycle, reuse. And the image here, of course, of the wind turbine blades that have passed their usable life, so they will have stress elements through them, and to leave them in place would cause them to fail and also fail the and so they're now landfill, and we have to find a way to actually not have this occur, because the same is occurring for used solar cells. We haven't found a way to recycle that in an effective manner at this moment in time. Good work is occurring, but we're not there yet. And the same with the batteries that we'll talk about as the battery elements. A Tesla car actually has 7,000 batteries in it to keep it running. And so if you sell a million cars, that's 7 billion batteries that you have to actually deal with at the end of their 15-year life, because like your calculator and your phone, your battery actually can only recharge and come back in a certain number of times. So these are the real issues that focuses the mining industry, is not just the extraction, but also the reuse and the repurpose of the metals that we extract from the industry. Next slide, please, Alexandra. And this is where it all starts. We forget that there is elements in there because we just talk about copper, but in fact, we have a periodic table of all sorts of metals and elements that make up. And if you take out the big ones in the Earth's crust, being the oxygen, silica, aluminium, iron, and calcium, 98% of the world's crust is made up of that. And then everything else is actually in the 2%. And so to some extent, you've got to find it and you've got to use it as you can. Right now, the focus is on those things that are creating our future. And so I've coloured those, copper, Cu. if we're going to be able to charge up our cars as we drive along the highway, there's going to need to be an energy transmission infrastructure put in place to enable you to charge up your car as you go. And whether that's from a local wind farm or a local's, and you have to have it available when the cars want to get charged. So you'll have to have batteries to support it, which take us to the battery metals, being the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, and the carbon. These are all key elements to achieve the environment and the outcomes that we're aspiring to with respect to what we're talking about at COP26 at this moment in time. The miners and the metals are critical to actually achieving what we're after. And in fact, the IMF has said there needs to be a 6-fold increase in critical minerals. And the critical minerals picks up those that are highlighted in yellow. Also the rare earths, the LA symbol, which is the top line there. And something that's perhaps a bit provocative that we need to contemplate as a society is uranium. Uranium moved on since the impacts of Chernobyl, 3 Mile, Fukushima. We got new fusion techniques with modularized, but if you're going to have a 0 carbon footprint, one of the elements is actually uranium energy production. I'm not advocating it, I'm merely expressing what's possible. Next slide, thanks, Alexandra. So what's the industry doing at this moment in time? First of all, if you've got an existing mine or existing, whether that's iron ore, Fortescue or Rio Tinto, they're moving electric trucks, electric shovels using solar powers around to deal with the infrastructure. We haven't quite got the capacity to do significant comminution, grinding and crushing because they're major concentrated power centres, but we will get there. And the next level, of course, is, and we heard it from Alexandra, is the hydrogen, where we use solar energy or wind power to actually create solar hydrogen, store it, and then use it in the vehicles and use it as an energy source. Okay, so they're the existing mines. What's the mines of the future going to do? First of all, we're going to go deeper and we're going to go underground and we're going to cave. And it's going to be run from people on the surface. And by the way, I'm illustrating here is the industry has been doing that in a constant way each century. It just keeps on moving on and on, improving. And by the way, I'd like to say that we do it because we're noble. However, we do it because it's economic. It is the best thing to do. And we've found that the way to be better is actually make these improvements. It's initially driven by economics, but now we also have this ESG overlay where governance will also drive us to act in a certain fashion. But I like to think we do that because it's the right thing anyway. Okay, next slide, thanks, Alexandra. Okay, and if you looked at our previous webinars, and I hope you, when you look at them in a week's time, when all three are together, you'll find that we already spoke about how technology is improving this. Water and how we use water in more arid regions throughout the world, and in Australia, essentially, we use saline water. There is copper mines now that use 5 times the salinity of seawater for its processed water. Energy is how we use less energy. We actually do flotation at a denser media, and then also pre-concentration, where we take the metal out and remove the waste before we put it through the comminution circuit. There is actually a history of innovation in the mining industry, and it's critical to our future that we keep on doing that. And we go to the next slide. I'll talk about tailings. And tailings also addressed in a previous webinar, but critical in that there is, due to improvements in technology, we've actually now be able to recover more from what was from ore bodies. And so we're now looking at our tailings depositions, historical tailings depositions, and we're assessing them and pulling coal out, the fine coals that previously reported, or metals, because now we can actually recover more copper, more gold, more silver. And we take this opportunity to also reposition the tailings so it creates a better societal outcome. It's not just the mining industry doing it for profit, although that's important because we have to be able to afford to do what we do. But it's also, we're repositioning tailings, we're using the economics of that to improve the societal outcomes, which I'll move to the next slide, thanks. And I just want to reiterate what, because as I said, we're big on E, smaller on S, and we think less about G, governance. If I go back to what Alexandra spoke about, this is a headline from 2 weeks ago. Antamina blockaded and stopped. Large copper producer, one of the biggest in the world, happens at Baumbas as well. Unless we get the communities and the stakeholders seeing the value equation for what they're doing and what we're doing, and it isn't just a belief that miners are there to essentially, you know, take it from the earth and disappear, we will fail. And so it's very important the S&G portion of ESG is enshrined in the way that we mine metals going forward. And by the way, I think we do a pretty damn good job. It's just going to have more and more focus. So to the final slide, thanks, Alexandra. And so what it is how do we create the value for both the local society and the stakeholders, such that everyone sees the value that comes to them that enables the world that we're trying to create, because mining is absolutely essential for us going forward. And so if I reflect on what was spoken about by Kevin, Alexandra, I'd finish by saying that mining is absolutely critical to achieving our envisaged future. And I say we cannot get there without mining, so it's key. We need the metals, it's as simple as that. There isn't another way to get energy and to live our lives once we remove fossil fuels. However, the social contract needs to be just and sound. It needs to provide the communities with value, and the stakeholders need to understand, whilst those that are contributing the capital, the shareholders, get a fair return as well. And so, whilst the current focus is energy transition and the metals necessary to achieve this, the mining sector has an important role to play in recycling, retreating historical waste, and continuing the technological gains that are necessary, that have kept us going for the last 100 years, because we've done a pretty good job. The challenge has just got bigger. And with that, I'll complete and I'll see whether there's any questions. Thank you very much, everyone. Right, a couple of questions. The one here, and I'll read aloud. I heard the other day that carbon output to producing an EV is 6 times that of a conventional vehicle. Is this accurate? Kevin, would you like to apply, and then I'll jump in if necessary? This is
sure.
the whole footprint of the car.
Yeah. So, you know, my understanding, and I used to do a lot of work on life cycle studies, and I think that's one of the ways to answer that question. And I'm pretty sure there have been different electric vehicle life cycle studies. The ones that I'm aware of, there's an inflection point where the embodied carbon in the materials that are going in an electric vehicle make the footprint higher for production. But then if you consider the use phase, then the electric vehicle starts to gain the lead. And the inflection point is driving miles or kilometers. You know, maybe 100,000 kilometers, depends on which kind of electric vehicle you have, the weights, etc. But that's my understanding. you'd have to go back to the literature, and if you're going to go back to the literature, I'd suggest the International Journal on Life Cycle Assessment, which has good peer review process and has published hundreds of good studies, and I'm sure there's some data and information in there.
Good, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, and I know recently that the advice was the most carbon efficient car that I read was a very small diesel, surprisingly enough, which, but as Kevin said, do the research, because I don't think any of us three on the this webinar are experts. One for me. Ron, do you think the value of metals to the world is the principal driver of community trust and acceptance that might drive building a local social license? I think absolutely, and the problem is that the communications we have with the local community, and Alexandra will talk to this because this is her specific field, it's like politicians trying to explain things that are technical, whether that's nuclear power or whatever. They tend to bring it back to what they understand as sound bites, and society is far more complex than that, and you actually have to spend time and actually give them context and explain why it works and why it's necessary. So I think it's absolutely critical. Alexandra, have anything to add on that?
Yes, I agree with what you have just mentioned, Ron, that understanding the communities and the local culture and how the local people communicate their needs, their aspirations, their desires, or even their vision of the future is very relevant to make sure that afterwards you drive that social license on a positive note.
Gavin, back to you. How do we move beyond boards and investors simply talking the talk and ticking the boxes to real embedded ESG considerations into all decisions?
Yeah, well, I think the people that are purporting or stating that they're doing these ESG evaluations and taking them into considerations, they have to be held accountable as well, right? I saw an analysis from Bloomberg, their sustainability analyst, video of him talking about this, and there's an explosion of ESG funds out there. Some of them very good, using good methodologies and working with the companies they're investing in and driving performance forward. And another bunch of them are just jumping on the bandwagon and purporting to be ESG funds, but there's no real beneficial outcomes coming out of those investments. So, I think the industry, there's going to be accountability mechanisms that are going to have to be put in place. And you're seeing that in the securities regulators are starting to look at this in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. I'm not sure about Australia, but they're saying, well, if you're claiming that you're mitigating risks through your investment strategy, prove it. Right? Prove there's an actual climate benefit, an actual social benefit to what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just, fooling investors that are going, the regular investor who's might be putting money in your fund. So I think that's a way to get accountability.
Good. Thank you, Kevin. And one challenge to the three of us here, and I'll, have we seen any mining customers successfully demonstrate how they're maintaining the social contract with the community through technology or other methods? I think that has meant mining companies. Now, may I caution my panelists that we're whether picking winners in the mining companies, but who do we admire as people who get their community contracts well? Has everyone got an opinion? I'll leave that open to both of you.
Yeah, there's a few that I've dealt with over the years, and of course these, the focus, the attention of the management on these issues can change when you have a change in management if it's not really hardwired in. But I've seen some great work in Alcoa, in Iceland, working there with the energy company at Landsverken, putting a smelter in place and coming up with a whole set of indicators for the community, and the community inputs into that and helps with monitoring. And you know, I don't know where the project is now, but it was groundbreaking at the time. Rio Tinto has done a lot of good stuff in different business units. Newmont is widely recognized for doing a better job on these things, but there's also some small companies out there that are thinking pretty creatively about what to do.
Alexandra, have you got someone that you would talk about from South America?
Yeah, I will say that actually most of the mining companies in South America have to do an outstanding job to maintain good relationship with the communities and have very interesting programs in place at the moment in many places. I mean, if you want, if you can get my contact and I can give you more specific details on some of the projects that I have seen in my career. But certainly they are doing very innovative ways to maintain that social relationships. But sometimes, and what I mentioned at some point during the presentation, is that this maintaining these good relationships sometimes goes beyond of what the private company can do. Sometimes there are political interests, sometimes there are a change of governments that are not, or even change of local, very local governments that don't make any positive changes in these communities. So it is a very difficult issue. Just to say that a mining company is not doing a good job, I don't think it goes like that. I think they are doing the best they can, and of course they can do even more if we have this good communication with the communities and we really understand. Because sometimes what we want in the future is not the same as they want in the future. What they see as progress is not the same as we see as progress. So we really need to understand their needs to make sure that we address their expectations and then strengthen that relationship in a long term.
Good answers. Now, I think we might have a quick pivot here, and it goes to example how blockchain is changing the industry, and we'll have to end there, and the rest of the questions we'll respond to if they keep on coming, and we'll be quite happy to do responses or whatever the mechanism. The blockchain, and say, I now have seen through, it's actually precious metals, and I think diamonds started in the first place with diamonds of conflict, and it's about actually being able to see the metal being green metal. In other words, it's done in a sustainable manner without, so in other words, you can track it all the way through its processing steps, the same as a diamond is also tracked all the way through its mining and processing steps, such that when you receive your product, you have a certificate that states clearly that with the blockchain analysis to demonstrate that the validity of what is being reported. Alexandra or Kevin, anything to add to that before we complete?
Yeah, I facilitated a meeting at ICMM a few years back looking at blockchain, and you know, Ron's right. It's the more precious metals, diamonds, that are earlier into the game on that. There was sort of two outcomes. I mean, a very interesting technology for tracking and verifying information related to a material along the chain. But the issues are, one, energy consumption, because blockchain technology uses up, the data mining and all that, uses up a lot of energy, much more than many people think about. And the second issue is, you know, like all data systems, garbage in, garbage out. So, you know, you got to make sure that the information going into each piece of the blockchain is accurate. So, you know, I think it's really interesting technology, but there's still work to be done to perfect it.
All right, and with that, I see we've hit our time. We're a little bit over it, and there's still a few more questions, and we're happy to respond to those, but we'll do them in a different forum. So may I thank my fellow presenters, Kevin and Alexandra, who are actually at the other side of the world, so it is late at night for them, and I appreciate their time. And with that, I will hand back to Kelvin of AusIM to close this session. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ron. I would now like to bring this webinar to a close. A big thank you to Kevin, Alexandra and Ron for taking the time and energy to present today. I would also like to thank everyone who attended and those who are viewing the recorded webinar. I hope you found the presentation today insightful and you will join us for future webinars. Thank you once again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.